Hello. Thank you so very much for joining me tonight. I found this book at a thrift store the other day, and I thought that maybe we could read it together. It's called Life After Life, and it's about near-death experiences. If talking about death makes you uncomfortable, this might not be the bedtime story for you. I'm sorry. But if it sounds interesting, then hang around with me for a little while as we read some bedtime stories. Life After Life by Raymond A. Moody Jr. Copyright 1976. Chapter 1. The Phenomenon of Death. What is it like to die? That is a question which humanity has been asking itself ever since there has been humans. Over the past few years, I have had the opportunity to raise this question before a sizable number of audiences. These groups have ranged from classes in psychology, philosophy, and sociology, through church organizations, television audiences, and civic clubs to professional societies of medicine. On the basis of this exposure, I can safely say that this topic excites the most powerful of feelings from people of very many emotional types and walks of life. Yet despite all of this interest, it remains true that it is very difficult for most people to talk about death. There are at least two reasons for this. One of them is primarily psychological and cultural. The subject of death is taboo. We feel perhaps only subconsciously that to be in contact with death in any way, even indirectly, somehow confronts us with the prospect of our own deaths, draws our own deaths closer, and makes them more real and thinkable. For example, most medical students, myself included, have found that even the remote encounter with death, which occurs upon one's first visit to the anatomical laboratories when entering medical school, can evoke strong feelings of uneasiness. In my own case, the reason for this response now seems quite obvious. It has occurred to me in retrospect that it wasn't entirely concerned for the person whose remains I saw there, although that feeling certainly figured too. What I was seeing on the table was a symbol of my own mortality. In some way, if only preconsciously, the thought must have been in my mind, that will happen to me too. Likewise, talking about death can be seen on the psychological level as another way of approaching it indirectly. No doubt many people have the feeling that to talk about death at all is in effect to conjure it up mentally, to bring it closer in such a way that one has to face up to the inevitability of one's own eventual demise. So to spare ourselves this psychological trauma, we decide to just try to avoid the topic as much as possible. The second reason it is difficult to discuss death is more complicated, as it is rooted in the very nature of language itself. For the most part, the words of human language allude to things of which we have experienced through our own physical senses. Death, though, is something which lies beyond the conscious experience of most of us, because most of us have never been through it. If we are to talk about death at all, then we must avoid both social taboos and deep-seated linguistic dilemmas which derive from our own experience, our own inexperience. What we often end up doing is talking in euphemistic analogies. We compare death or dying with more pleasant things in our experience, things with which we are familiar. Perhaps the most common analogy of this type is the comparison between death and sleep. Dying, we tell ourselves, is like going to sleep. This figure of speech occurs very commonly in everyday thought and language, as well as in literature of many cultures and many ages. It was apparently quite common even in the time of the ancient Greeks. In the Iliad, for example, Homer calls sleep death's sister, and Plato in his dialogue The Apology put the following words into the mouth of his teacher Socrates, who has just been sentenced to death by an Athenian jury. Now if death is only a dreamless sleep, it must be a marvelous gain. I suppose that if anyone were to pick out the night on which he slept so soundly as to not even dream, and then to compare it with all the other nights and days of his life, and then were told to say, after due consideration, how many better and happier days and nights than this he had spent in the course of his life, well, I think that anyone would find these days and nights easy to count in comparison with the rest. If death is like this, then I call it gain, because the whole of time, if you look at it in this way, can be regarded as no more than one single night. This same analogy is embedded in our own contemporary language. Consider the phrase, to put to sleep. If you present your dog to a veterinarian with the instruction to put him to sleep, you would normally mean something very different than you would upon taking your wife or husband to an anesthesiologist with the same words. Others prefer a different but related analogy. Dying, they say, is like forgetting. When one dies, one forgets all one's woes, all one's painful and troubling memories are all obliterated. As old and as widespread as they may be, however, both the sleeping and the forgetting analogies are ultimately inadequate insofar as comforting us concerned. Each is a different way of making the same assertion, even though they tell us in a somewhat more palatable way. Both say, in effect, death is simply the alienation of conscious experience forever. If this is so, then death really doesn't have any of the desirable features of sleeping and forgetting. Sleeping is a positive, desirable experience in life because waking follows it. A restful night's sleep makes the waking hours following it more pleasant and productive. If waking did not follow it, the benefits of sleep would not be possible. Similarly, alienation of all conscious experience implies not only the obliteration of all painful memories, but of all pleasant ones too. So upon analysis, neither analogy is close enough to give us any real comfort or hope in facing death. There is another view, however, which disavows the notion that death is alienation of consciousness. According to this other, perhaps more ancient tradition, some aspect of the human being survives even after the physical body ceases to function, and is ultimately destroyed. This persistent aspect has been called by many names, among them psyche, soul, mind, spirit, self, being, and consciousness. By whatever name it is called, the notion that one passes into another realm of existence upon physical death is among the most venerable of human beliefs. There is a graveyard in Turkey which was used by Neanderthal men approximately 100,000 years ago. Their fossilized imprints have enabled archaeologists to discover that these ancient men buried their dead in biers of flowers, indicating that they perhaps saw death as an occasion of celebration, as a transition of the dead from this world to the next. Indeed, graves from very early sites all over the earth give evidence of the belief in human survival of bodily death. In short, we are faced with two contrasting answers to our original question about the nature of death, both of ancient differation, both widely held even today. Some say that death is alienation of consciousness. Others say with equal confidence that death is the passage of the soul or mind into another dimension of reality. In what follows, I do not wish in any way to dismiss either answer. I simply wish to give a report on a search which I have personally undertaken. During the past few years, I have encountered a large number of persons who were involved in what I shall call near-death experiences. I have met these persons in many ways. At first, it was by coincidence. In 1965, when I was an undergraduate student studying philosophy at the University of Virginia, I met a man who is a clinical professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine. I was struck from the beginning with his warmth, kindness, and humor. It came as a great surprise when I later learned a very interesting fact about him, namely that he had been dead, not just once, but on 2 occasions, about 10 minutes apart, and that he had been given a most fantastic account of what happened to him while he was dead. I later heard him relate his story to a small group of interested students. At the time, I was most impressed, but since I had little background from which to judge such experiences, I filed it away, both in my mind and in the form of a tape recording of his talk. After class one day, a student stopped by to see me. He asked whether he might discuss the subject of immortality. He had an interest in the subject because his grandmother had died during an operation and had recounted a very amazing experience. I asked him to tell me about it, and much to surprise, he related almost the same series of events which I had heard the psychiatry professor describe some years before. At this time, my search for cases became a bit more active, and I began to include readings on the subject of human survival, of biological death in my philosophy courses. I was careful not to mention the 2 death experiences in my courses. I adopted, in effect, a wait-and-see attitude. If such reports were fairly common, I thought I would probably hear more of it. To my amazement, I found that in almost every class of 30 or more students, at least one student would come to me afterwards and relate a personal near-death experience. What has amazed me since the beginning of my interest are the great similarities in the reports, despite the fact that they come from people of highly varied religious, social, and educational backgrounds. By the time I entered medical school in 1972, I had collected a sizable number of these experiences. I found that after every talk, someone would come up to tell me of an experience of his own. As I became more widely known for this interest, doctors began to refer to me persons whom they had resuscitated and who reported unusual experiences. Still others have written to me with reports after newspaper articles about my studies appeared. At the present time, I know of approximately 150 cases of this phenomenon. The experiences which I have studied fall into three distinct categories. 1. The experiences of persons who were resuscitated after having been thought, adjudged, or pronounced clinically dead by their doctors. 2. The experiences of persons who, in the course of accidents or severe injury or illness, came very close to physical death. 3. The experiences of persons who, as they died, told them to other people who were present. Later, these other people reported the content of the death experience to me. From the vast amount of material that could be derived from 150 cases, selection obviously has occurred. Some of it has been purposeful. For example, although I have found reports of the third type to complement and to agree very well with the experiences of the first two types, I have for the most part dropped them from the consideration for two reasons. First, it helps to reduce the number of cases studied to a more manageable level. And second, it enables me to stick as close as possible to first-hand reports. Thus, I have interviewed in great detail some 50 persons upon cases of the first type, those in which an apparent clinical death actually occurs, are certainly more dramatic than those of the second type, in which only a close brush with death occurs. Indeed, whenever I have given public talks on this phenomenon, the death episodes have invariably drawn most of the interest. Accounts in the press have sometimes been written as to suggest they are the only types of case with which I have dealt. However, in selecting the cases to be presented in this book, I have avoided the temptation to dwell only on those cases in which a death event took place. For as will become obvious, cases of the second type are not different from, but rather form a continuum with, cases of the first type. Also, through the near-death experiences themselves are remarkably similar, both circumstances surrounding them and the persons describing them vary widely. Accordingly, I have tried to give a sample of my experiences which adequately reflects this variation. With these qualifications in mind, let us now turn to a consideration of what may happen as far as I have been able to discover during the experience of dying. That was chapter 1, guys. Let me know if you want me to read chapter 2.